One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. In the dedicatory prayer of the Kanesville Tabernacle, President Gordon B. Hinckley stated, "May the Tabernacle stand as a landmark in this community. May it be a place to remember and ponder the lives and deeds of men and women who were endowed with a great, overpowering sense of mission, and who, out of love for a great cause, were willing to give their all, even life itself. May the realistic recreation of the past become a sobering part of the present, that there will be a grateful remembrance of those who have gone before." We're joined today by Gary Boatwright, Jr. Gary has worked for the Church History Department since the year 2000. He's currently a historic sites researcher, where he ultimately writes historic site guides for the missionaries that work at church historical sites. Faithful Legacy listeners will remember Gary from episodes about Sharon, Vermont and Liberty Jail. Gary, welcome back to Legacy.
Okay, I'm glad to be here.
As mentioned in that opening quote, we're discussing the Kanesville Tabernacle as a historic site and the city of Kanesville, Iowa, as an important place in church history. People new to LDS church history may be hearing the name Kanesville for the very first time. Gary, will you please help us out? Where is it, and can you put this place in some kind of historical perspective for us?
Well, Kanesville, as it once was known, now is known today as Council Bluffs, Iowa. It's right along the Missouri River and just almost southeast of Omaha a little bit. So if anybody's been in the Midwest there, it's just right there in the winter quarters area of the church, which many church members are familiar with.
So what was Kanesville or Council Bluffs before the Latter-day Saints arrived there?
Well, Kanesville was home to many Native Americans before the Saints moved there. The name Council Bluffs actually comes from Lewis and Clark, who, on their journey to the Pacific, as they were traveling up the Missouri River, they met with a number of Native Americans in council, and there are a number of bluffs in the area, so Lewis and Clark, they named it Council Bluffs. And a few years before the Mormons moved there, the United States Army was there. They were there protecting the Potawatomi Indians, and they built a few homes and a place called the Block House. Then other missionaries came in prior to the Saints, but when the Saints arrived in 1846 after their long trek across Iowa, there wasn't much there besides this block house and a few other structures that had been built. It was pretty much frontier territory still at the time of the Saints when they arrived.
Were there other settlers?
There were a few at the time of the arrival. For the most part, the city began to grow after the Saints, as we find in other Latter-day Saint communities before Kanesville. They were primarily the first settlers who were there and who remained there for a period of time. And Kanesville became one of the primary outfitting posts for the Latter-day Saints and also for many other settlers who were going to California during the gold rush in the late 1840s and early 1850s.
If I understand it correctly, Kanesville wasn't the only Latter-day Saint settlement around this time during the migration.
No, as the Saints moved across Iowa in 1846, they set up a number of other settlements. Mount Pisgah and Garden Grove are two of the most well-known. And, of course, we know about winter quarters, those on the western side of the Missouri River, which was really church headquarters for a couple of years there. And a lot of the attention gets focused on winter quarters and also even Mount Pisgah and Garden Grove, and Kanesville is sometimes lost in the discussion when it comes to the Pioneer Trek. And so that's why, we're here to try to raise awareness of Kanesville and discuss the history that took place there.
So in your guide, you make reference to the Grand Encampment. What actually does that mean?
Well, the Grand Encampment was exactly what it sounds. It was a big camp. When the saints began flowing into the Council Bluffs area in 1846, they just began to establish camps. And as more and more saints came across Iowa, this camps just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and to eventually where it was known as the Grand Encampment. And Thomas L. Kane, who was a friend of the saints, he visited the Grand Encampment, and he left us a description of what it was like. And he says that the bottomlands were crowded with covered carts and wagons, and each one of the Council Bluff hills opposite was crowned with its own great camp, gay with bright white canvas and alive with the busy stir of swarming occupants. In the clear blue morning air, the smoke streamed up from more than 1,000 cooking fires. Countless roads and bypaths checkered all manner of geometric figures on the hillsides. Herd boys were dozing upon the slopes, sheep and horses, cows and oxen were feeding around them, and other herds in the luxuriant meadow of the then swollen river. From a single point I counted 4,000 head of cattle in view at one time, and as I approached the camps it seemed to me the children there were to prove still more numerous. And so if you look at really what Thomas L. Kane is saying, there was a lot of people in this geographic area with, not only the people, but their cattle, their other animals, and their tents and their wagons. And so it was essentially one big camp of saints. And it's kind of started to form into a small city. As he mentioned, they made roads and kind of cordon off little sections. But it was really just one big camp where the saints, as they came across Iowa, where they rested and regained much of their strength after the grueling trek.
So once the settlements started to grow and become more city-like, was it considered the Grand Encampment anymore? Or is that when it started to become winter quarters in Kanesville?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Grand Encampment eventually broke up. The saints obtained permission to settle on lands, which we know now as winter quarters. And so with these temporary settlements assigned, the saints began to disperse. And a number of saints remained in what would be Kanesville. And there were also a number of settlements on the Iowa side of the river as well. So this large group of saints essentially dispersed and made their winter quarters for that year to prepare for the trek the following year in 1847.
Since more people seem to be familiar with winter quarters, can you kind of compare the two as far as time and place is concerned?
Kanesville actually lasted longer than winter quarters. Winter quarters, we hear a lot about it, I think primarily because it was the headquarters for the church. Winter quarters is where Brigham Young and the 12 apostles lived, where they held their meetings. And also, we know that the winter of 1846 and 1847 was a very tough winter. And the majority of the writings we get describing that winter come from people who were living in winter quarters. But Kanesville was going on simultaneously. Orson Hyde was assigned to preside over the saints there. He actually lived in a small area called Hyde's Park, named after himself. But as the saints, as the 1847 Vanguard Company left and came back to winter quarters, in 1848 they were asked to disband winter quarters. And so many of the saints who were living in winter quarters on the western side of the Missouri River moved over to the eastern side. And so Kanesville is just, the population exploded with all these folks coming over. And of course, a lot of saints left to go to the Salt Lake Valley that year. But by the end of 1848, winter quarters really was no longer in existence. And the majority of the saints had moved over to Iowa side of the river to Kanesville and other the other settlements in Iowa.
Our listeners may have heard the episode. It's actually episode 1 with Jenny Lund, where we talk specifically about winter quarters, and they can find a little bit more about that and why the Saints left when they did, etc. So it's an interesting episode. In your site guide, you name 3 key messages that we can take from the Kanesville area. This and this time as well. Let's talk about those key messages and what events make those messages valid.
Okay. Well, the 3 key messages that have been identified for the Kanesville Tabernacle is succession in the presidency, community and cooperation, and journeys of sacrifice. And let me just back up a little to explain what these key messages are. For every historic site, we want visitors to walk away with 2 or 3 or even 5 concepts regarding that site. So, for example, like at the Joseph Smith birthplace, we want people to walk away learning about the ancestry of the prophet Joseph, his family, and then his calling as a prophet. So these key messages are the messages that their missionaries formulate their tours around. So hopefully visitors, when they go to these sites, they walk away learning these concepts. The key message, succession in the presidency, that revolves around the reorganization of the First Presidency. In the fall of 1847, after Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 had returned to winter quarters, they met in a conference in early December of 1847. And the place where they were holding the conference was really small, and they were trying to get all the saints in there, but it was just too small to adequately conduct business. So they decided in that meeting to build a new tabernacle, which is the Kanesville Tabernacle. Well, the following day after they adjourned the conference, they met in the home of Orson Hyde in Hyde Park on December 5th, 1847. And it was in this meeting that the Quorum of the 12 decided to reorganize the First Presidency with Brigham Young as president and Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richards as counselors. And it was a couple of weeks later in the newly constructed tabernacle on December 27th, 1847, that the First Presidency was sustained by the membership of the church. And so that is the key, the primary thing that we want visitors to learn about when they go to the site. The second key message, community and cooperation. This is a key message that we could probably have at every one of our historic sites. Just as Latter-day Saints, they built communities wherever they went, and it took cooperation to build those communities. And especially where Kanesville served as it was a resting place for many of the saints. A lot of the saints specifically coming over from England, that was a long trek across the ocean, and they were only halfway done when they got to Kanesville, and so they needed to rest. And many of them were poor as well. So the community would gather around them, sustain them, uplift them, provide for their needs, and help them to prepare for the trek west. And also just the building of Kanesville, going from a site with, just a handful of buildings to a flourishing community in a matter of years took a great deal of cooperation among the saints. And the third key message, journeys of sacrifice, we're talking about 2 journeys. Obviously, the trek to Utah is the first one. But the second one is the journey of the Mormon Battalion to San Diego. It was in Kanesville that the Mormon Battalion was mustered in 1846. And, these 500 volunteers left their families in the middle of almost nowhere and marched across the rest of the continent, reaching the Pacific Ocean. And that was a sacrifice not only on part of the men who did that, but on their families who were left behind to almost fend for themselves. And again, this comes back to the community and cooperation as well, where the community came together and rallied around these women and families whose husbands and fathers had left to go to the Mormon battalion. So if you go to the Kanesville Tabernacle today, those are the three messages that you hear, and the exhibits and the stories are centered around those three important elements.
Very good. We will discuss a little more in depth those three messages. My name is Nathan Wright, and you're listening to Legacy on the Mormon Channel. We're visiting with Gary Boatwright about historic Kanesville, Iowa. Can you tell me, is there a significance to the timing of the reorganization of the First Presidency? I mean, they had spent a couple of years in Nauvoo previously, and they'd already been out west, and here Brigham Young was traveling back toward the east. What is the significance of this timing? Well,
the succession in the presidency, that's kind of an interesting question that historians have wondered, why then? Why didn't they just reorganize following the death of the prophet? But I think if you go back and look at the history, with the death of the prophet in 1844, Brigham and members of the Quorum of the 12, they were back east on the missionary work and also campaigning for the prophet for his presidential campaign. But when Brigham Young first heard about the death of the prophet and of Hiram, he wondered if the keys had been taken away, the keys of the kingdom had been taken away from the church. Let me just read this, Brigham Young's words. He says, "The first thing I thought of was whether Joseph had taken the keys of the kingdom with him from the earth. Brother Orson Pratt sat on my left, and we were both leaning back on our chairs. Bringing my hand down on my knee, I said, 'The keys of the kingdom are right here with the church.'" And so Brigham and the 12, we know he knew that they held the keys of the kingdom. And he knew that he had the inspiration of the Lord to guide the church. And at that time, they felt that it was the Quorum of the 12's responsibility to lead the church, which they did successfully. They successfully finished building the Nauvoo temple. They left Nauvoo with thousands of saints following them. They established a new gathering place in the Salt Lake Valley and traveled back to winter quarters. And Brigham Young, he had in his mind about reorganizing the First Presidency for quite some time. He believed that the church, in order to be fully organized, that it needed to have a First Presidency. And also, the Quorum of the 12, they had been so bogged down with administrative duties during these 3 years that they hadn't been able to go out and proclaim the gospel as they're meant to. So he began discussions with the Quorum of the 12 long before 1847, but when they returned back from Salt Lake, he really felt the need to organize or to reorganize the First Presidency. And in fact, Brigham Young, he stated that from the time I have been in Great Salt Lake City till now, the tappings of the Spirit to me is the church ought to be now organized. And so he began discussions with the Quorum of the 12 about why the First Presidency should be reorganized. And they held numerous council meetings in winter quarters and also in Kanesville. And as I mentioned, it was on December 5th that they finally decided to reorganize the First Presidency. But there were a number of other things that were going on that kind of preceded the reorganization of the Quorum of the First Presidency. And the first I briefly mentioned is that they had found a new gathering place. They had established what they started to do, but they also realized that with the new gathering places that many saints were going to be separated by thousands of miles. We'd have the saints who were in the Salt Lake Valley and building up the community there, and the saints who would be in the eastern United States preparing to come to the valley. And so there needed to be some leadership there. And again, the second thing was the Quorum of the 12. They had a scriptural mandate to preach the gospel to the world. And with them administering the church as the first presidency, they were not able to fulfill that in the capacity that Brigham Young thought they should do. Another thing that contributed, I believe, to the reorganization of the first presidency was there was a number of splinter groups who were still claiming the authority to lead the church. The most notable of these was James Strang. He had reorganized his own first presidency. And for some of the saints who were, I don't want to say weak in faith, but they were, they saw that he was setting up something that was familiar, a first presidency and a Quorum of the 12. And I think many of them may have just been impatient with Brigham. But James Strang was quite successful in winning converts to his cause in the winter quarters in Kanesville area. And so I think Brigham Young, seeing that, felt the need that, we need to get the church organized so we can function as a first presidency, and so the Quorum of the 12 can be out there strengthening the members, preaching the gospel. But ultimately, it was the Lord's will that the first presidency be reorganized. As Brigham said, the Spirit had been prompting him to do this. And I believe that that night on December 5th, 1847, when the Quorum of the 12 met, that each one of them had for themselves an impression that this is what the Lord wanted to do. And as you read through the minutes of that meeting, you can see that kind of coming to pass. And, there wasn't a grand revelation or anything. It was just the subtle promptings of the Spirit. And each member of the Quorum of the 12 expressing their feelings that, this is right. I feel this is right, and the Spirit is prompting us to do this. And so ultimately it was the Lord's will that the first presidency be reorganized.
It seems there's a quote in your guide from Bathsheba Smith, who may not have been in the meeting, but she said the spirit that lingered in that Orson Hyde home was so strong that she certainly felt it.
Yeah, she did. And in fact, the quote that you're referring to, this is in her reminiscences that she wrote many years later. Bathsheba Smith, she was the wife of George A. Smith, who was one of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who was in this meeting. And she wrote, "On one occasion we visited Hyde Park in company with the 12 Apostles. At this time they held a council in a log cabin, and a great manifestation of the Holy Spirit was poured out upon those present. Here they unanimously decided to organize the first presidency of the church according to the pattern laid down in the Book of Covenants. I slept in the cabin that night, and the sweet influence of the Holy Spirit, which had been enjoyed in the council, still remained." And so this obviously was a spiritual experience for the Quorum of the 12, so much so that those who were in the home after the meeting could still feel the presence of the Spirit.
So let's discuss a little bit about the second message, the community of the saints. This wasn't the first time that they had built a city, and was it just a bunch of log cabins? Can you describe Kanesville a little bit for us?
Yeah, Kanesville, as I mentioned, there wasn't much there when they first got there, but the saints being who they were and having experience in building numerous communities, the area quickly turned into a prosperous community. And a lot of that prosperity was a result of the finding of gold in California. And so not only were the saints using this as an outfitting post, but the thousands of 49ers who were going to California. And so with the community and the demands of people needing equipment, numerous stores popped up. Orson Hyde began a newspaper called the Frontier Guardian. Other various types of buildings, the government buildings, a courthouse was built. And so really just within a matter of a few short years, this community blossomed into a prosperous city. And if you were to walk down the streets of Kanesville back in 1842, 1843, you would see a lot of log and wood structures. There was plenty of cottonwood around the region, which they used. There was just a few brick buildings at the time. One of them was a powder house that was located up on the bluff. And in fact, I found a quote from a person who was writing a history of Council Bluffs, and he says that, the powder house was, made out of brick, and it was located in an area of the city that if it ever blew up, that everybody in the city would have a brick for themselves. But as the city continued to grow, a lot of other people who weren't members of the church found it to be a wonderful place to live. And it was this core of non-members that stayed in Council Bluffs and continued to expand the city and live there. And there are many families in Council Bluffs today who can trace back their ancestors to some of the earliest settlers of Kanesville.
We talk about Kanesville and winter quarters, but according to a little map I saw in the guide, there were dozens of other communities, cities, shall we say.
There were.
Tell us about that.
It's very similar to what happened when the Saints came to Utah. There was a core area, which was Salt Lake City, and then Brigham Young sent others out to settle other areas of what would become the state of Utah. And the same with Kanesville is, we talked about the Grand Encampment, and having that many people in such a small area was kind of a drain on resources. You also had to worry about the health and well-being of people. I mean, you have that many people together, their waste has to go somewhere, and so it's just not healthy. So the Saints decided that they would spread out and just create a number of settlements throughout Iowa, throughout western Iowa and eastern Nebraska. Some of the major settlements, as we know, was Kanesville and also Hyde Park. But by also kind of spreading out, the Saints they were allowed space for farming and grazing. They could gather firewood. And these communities, they all flourished. But from the onset, they were all designed to be temporary communities. Where in Nauvoo, the Saints thought they would be there for a while. But with the Exodus, they knew that they were going west to the mountains. And so any communities that they built up in Iowa, they knew were going to be temporary. But despite that fact, they still built up wonderful communities. And you would, if you were to walk down the streets of Kanesville or many of these other communities, you would never guess that the Saints had every intention to leave them. But they did. And I think, again, that just shows that when the Saints go about to build something, even if it's just on a temporary basis, they're going to build it as best as they can and make it a place where they can be as comfortable as they can for the time being that they're there. But the majority of these settlements after 1852 and 1853 were abandoned by the Saints. Some of them, like Kanesville, where there was a large majority of non-members of the church, continued to flourish and are still cities today, but a lot of them just kind of disappeared, like Mount Pisgah and Garden Grove. If you go visit those sites now, there's not a lot there. It's all farmland, minus a couple of historic markers. You would never know that they had once been communities where the saints had lived.
Thank you. As a reminder, you're listening to Legacy. Today we're talking about the Kanesville Tabernacle, and Gary Boatwright is visiting with us. I would think that as part of this second message, community and cooperation, perhaps the return of Oliver Cowdery to the church might be included in that. Can you tell us about that event?
Yes. When people hear about Kanesville, that's one of the few stories that they do know about, is the return of Oliver Cowdery. And, as we know, Oliver Cowdery was involved with the early events of the Restoration. He was with Joseph Smith during the translation of the Book of Mormon. He was under the hands of John the Baptist. He received the Aaronic priesthood, and, from Peter, James, and John, the Melchizedek priesthood. He was the first person baptized in this dispensation. And he was ultimately the assistant president of the church. But due to some conflicts in Missouri, he was one of the many early church leaders who were excommunicated from the church. And after leaving the church, he went back to Ohio, began a law firm where he practiced for some time, but he still held some ties to the church. He was really good friends with Brigham Young's brother, Phineas Young, and if I remember correctly, Phineas Young had married Oliver Cowdery's sister, and so they were brother-in-laws. But in November 1847, let me even back up a little before then. Even before the saints left for the Salt Lake Valley, they were communicating with Oliver Cowdery. It wasn't, a frequent communication, but Brigham Young would kind of send out fillers to Oliver Cowdery to have him come back to the church. And in November 1847, Brigham Young, writing for the entire Quorum of the 12, he asked Oliver Cowdery to return to our Father's house from whence thou hast wandered. And with Phineas Young, Phineas was kind of the messenger person between the Quorum of the 12, and I'm sure Phineas Young and Oliver Cowdery had many conversations about the church and about things that were happening. And Oliver, he was interested in what was going on. I mean, these were his friends and his family in many cases. And 3 months following this letter that he received from Brigham Young, Oliver Cowdery responded and, said, I want to come visit with the saints on the Missouri River. And in the fall of 1848, he did. He and his family, with Phineas Young, traveled to Kanesville. And on October 29th of 1848, the church was gathered in the Kanesville Tabernacle for a meeting. Orson Hyde was at the pulpit speaking, and all of a sudden in walks Oliver Cowdery. And Orson Hyde immediately recognized who he was and went down from the stand, and the two men embraced. And many of the people in the congregation were converts to the church after the excommunication of Oliver Cowdery, and so they didn't know who this man was who was coming in and who Orson Hyde was embracing. And so Orson Hyde brought Oliver Cowdery up to the stand and introduced him and asked him to share basically his testimony. And he shared with the congregation some of the events of the early Restoration and bore his testimony to the truth of those events, of the restoration of the priesthood and of the wonderful things that he and the prophet witnessed in the Kirtland Tabernacle. But he also told the congregation in that meeting that the 12 were the only men that could lead the church after the death of Joseph, and that every man that wished to do right would follow the main channel of the stream, meaning that they would follow the corner of the 12. Well, a few days later, on November 5th, Oliver Cowdery met with the High Council, the Potawatomi High Council as it was called, and here he expressed his desire to return in full fellowship to the church. And he didn't want to come back as a leader in the church. He really just wanted to come back and enjoy the fellowship of the saints that he had missed for the previous few years. And in that meeting, he stated that I have not come to seek place nor to interfere with the business and calling of those men who have borne the burden since the death of Joseph. I wish to be one of your number and be a mere member of the church, and my mere asking to be baptized is an end to all pretensions to authority. And he was allowed to be rebaptized, and on November 12th, 1848, he was baptized by Orson Hyde. And Oliver, he left Kanesville in the spring of 1849 to go back home, and he had every desire to migrate with the saints to the Salt Lake Valley. But in 1849, due to financial circumstances, he wasn't able to, so he made plans to move with the saints in 1850. But that year, his health declined. And so ultimately on March 3rd, 1850, he passed away in Richmond, Missouri. But prior to his death, as he was surrounded by his family and friends, Oliver shared his testimony of the gospel. And Phineas Young, who was at his bedside when he passed away, recorded that his last testimony will never be forgotten by many. He said to his friends, there was no salvation but in the valley and through the priesthood there. And so this, wonderful man who was heavily involved in the miraculous events of the restoration, unfortunately had some conflicts and misunderstandings with the prophet, was excommunicated. But he realized what he had left. And he came back knowing full well the door that he needed to enter with baptism, and just wanted to become a member of the church again, and to feel the blessings of the gospel in his life again. But unfortunately, an early death led to him not being able to gather with the saints in the valley.
It seems that his testimony, being such a big part of the early part of the church, would be the significance of him coming back into the church, not only for the membership at that time, but for us as well.
Yeah,
he's a key figure that just never denied what he knew to be true.
That
Very
is
significant.
true.
Let's talk about the Mormon Battalion. Casual historians may still believe that the call for soldiers from among Pioneer Latter-day Saints came as a surprise to church leaders. But from what I understand, that is not the case at all.
No, it wasn't a surprise at all. In fact, Brigham Young, he had sent a brother by the name of Jesse Little to Washington, D.C., to try to convince and urge the government to call a battalion of Mormon soldiers. Brigham Young knew that they would be going west, and he thought, well, if we can get many of our saints to the west at the expense of the government, let's do it. And also I think personally that there was many kind of misunderstandings between the saints and the U.S. government. And I think the government thought that they were not traitorous, but just weren't full citizens and supporting their government. But I think Brigham Young did this to kind of tell the government, we're Americans. We support our country, and we're willing to help where we can, despite the fact that, we've been driven from place to place and we haven't gained the protection of the Constitution, but we're still citizens of this country. But it was Jesse C. Little, as I mentioned, who was asked by Brigham Young to go and ask the government if there was any way that the Saints could help, whether that was a battalion or whether, they would build fortifications along the route going to the west. But before he arrived in Washington, D.C., Jesse Little was preaching in Philadelphia. And he was talking about many of the persecutions that had come upon the Saints in previous years. And Thomas L. Kane was in the audience that day. And this is where the friendship with Thomas L. Kane and the church begins. He met with Jesse Little, learned of his intentions, and Thomas L. Kane was a very influential man, came from a very influential family from Pennsylvania. And so Thomas Kane went with Jesse Little to Washington, D.C. They met with numerous officials in the government, many members of the cabinet, and even President Polk himself, and asked that, the Saints be given an opportunity to help. Well, ultimately it was decided that, war had broken out with Mexico, and it was decided, and President Polk authorized the creation of a battalion of Saints, which ultimately came to be the Mormon Battalion. So yeah, it was, it wasn't a surprise for Brigham Young when, the Army showed up in Council Bluffs and was asking for men for the Army. I think it was a welcome petition that he received, because that was what they were hoping for all along. But many of the members of the church at the time, I don't think they understood really what was going on. And
didn't see the big picture.
Yeah, and so many of them were kind of frustrated with, here was the government who denied to protect us, and now they're asking to take away 500 of our best men at a time when, we haven't even got to the place we're going yet. And in fact, there's a quote here from Zadok Judd, who was a member of the church. He said, in reference to the calling of the Mormon Battalion, he said, "This was quite a hard pill to swallow, to leave wives and children on the wild prairies, destitute and almost helpless, having nothing to rely on, only kindness of neighbors, and go to fight the battles of a government that had allowed some of its citizens to drive us from our homes. But the word comes from the right source and seemed to bring the spirit of conviction of its truth with it, and there was quite a number of our company volunteered, myself and my brother among them." And another member of the church, James Brown, he later surmised that, "I do not suppose there is an individual in the battalion who had been left to his own thoughts and feelings, independent of counsel, would have enlisted. I would have felt very reluctant under the circumstances had it not been for the counsel of my brethren, whom God authorized to dictate the affairs of his kingdom." So here, the Saints, many of them were reluctant to do this. They were counseled by Brigham Young and their leaders that, this is a good opportunity for us. We can get many of our Saints to the west, and the money that they would make would benefit the church and their families who would be remaining along the Missouri River. And that money helped to outfit many of the Saints so that they could travel west. I mean, the Mormon Battalion, the enlistment of the Mormon Battalion at this time really was a blessing to the church. And, it wasn't a hindrance. It was a wonderful thing that, looking back on it now, we can see just what a wonderful thing it was for the Saints at that time.
So this was the beginning of the involvement of Thomas Kane, hence the name, Kanesville, Iowa. From the beginning of his involvement, when did the actual renaming of the community happen?
It actually occurred rather quickly. When the Saints first arrived in the area, the general area was known as Council Bluffs, but a good brother by the name of Henry Miller was kind of the first to permanently settle there. And so for a short time, it was called Miller's Hollow. And, following the arrival of Thomas L. Kane, and the neat thing with Thomas L. Kane, when he was in Kanesville, when he was in this area we call Kanesville, he became sick. And the Saints, nurtured him and brought him back to health. And it was from that moment that he decided he was going to help these people and other downtrodden people as much as he can. And so this friendship just blossomed there. And the Saints, realizing that, this man is a blessing to them and is someone who can help them, they wanted to honor him. And so it was, as I mentioned, the community was known as Miller Hollow, after Henry Miller. Then for a short time, it was just known as Kane. There was a petition to establish a post office in the area, and they decided to call it Kane. But it was on April 8th, 1848, during a conference, that the church decided to rename the city Kanesville in honor of Thomas L. Kane. And the community was known as Kanesville until the fall of 1852 and early 1853. And with most of the Saints having left the community, the reasoning for having it named Kanesville was gone. Non-members, Thomas Kane, didn't mean a thing to non-members, and so they renamed the city again Council Bluffs, and that's the name that the community is known by today.
Thomas Kane was a very significant part of the early church. He was a great friend to Brigham Young and the freedoms of the Latter-day Saints. And to find out more about him, we had an episode about Thomas Kane, episode 37. We were visiting with Matthew Groh, author and historian. So we invite listeners to download that if you have any more questions about Thomas Kane. We are talking today with Gary Boatwright about Kanesville and the tabernacle there. Let's talk about present day, the actual site. When did it come about? How did it get started to be?
Well, the Kanesville Tabernacle, the reconstruction that's there now wasn't originally owned by the church. It was in the early 1990s when the idea to rebuild the Kanesville Tabernacle kind of began to take root. And there was a good brother by the name of Monty Nelson who was serving as a director of the Mormon Trail Center over on the Iowa side of the river. And he was invited to a meeting in Council Bluffs of the Pottawatomie County Mormon Trails Association. And in this meeting, he went over basically just to visit and, kind of express goodwill on behalf of the church, but he was spontaneously asked to make some remarks. And so he got up and the thought came to him, why don't I challenge this group of people to rebuild the Kanesville Tabernacle? And he did. And he says he was, led by the Spirit in doing that. And so the momentum started that, maybe we ought to rebuild this. And groups got together and Kanesville Restoration Incorporated was founded. There were numerous fundraising efforts and property was purchased and the site was erected. And in 1996, the tabernacle and accompanying visitor center was dedicated by President Hinckley. And so today visitors can go to the site. It's right in the heart of Council Bluffs. There's a wonderful visitor center that people learn about the story of Kanesville and the calling of the Mormon Battalion, and then they can go into the tabernacle and learn about the reorganization of the First Presidency. And with most of our sites, we try to either rebuild or reconstruct the sites on the locations where they were. But when Kanesville Restoration was developing this, the original site of the tabernacle was not available. But they went ahead and proceeded to purchase some property, which is about a block south of the original location. And in constructing it, they tried to build it as close as they could to the original.
How did they know? Did they have some plans, original drawings?
Actually, we did. Thomas Bullock created some drawings of it. We have another sketch that was later printed in a newspaper that gave us a good idea of the outsides. But also, members of the church are wonderful journal keepers. And so much of the record of the building and the materials and the size were kept by numerous people. So they really had a good idea of how to rebuild this tabernacle. And, of course, they had to build it to modern code. So there are, some things that aren't the same. But one of the interesting things that I find is that they built the tabernacle out of the same material the original was built out of, and that was green cottonwood. And, I'm not a contractor or anything, but I know that green wood eventually shrinks. And with the original tabernacle, that was actually the demise of the tabernacle, was this green cottonwood. It shrinked and the structure became unstable, and they eventually had to dismantle the tabernacle. But when they rebuilt the tabernacle, they used the green cottonwood, but they were able to engineer it in such a way that they could, over time, compensate for that shrinking, allowing the tabernacle to stand. And, the rebuilt tabernacle has lasted, more than double the time the original tabernacle has lasted. And we hope that it's there for a long time so visitors can come visit.
I think when we think of a tabernacle, the Salt Lake Tabernacle comes to mind. And can you give us an idea of its size, the Kanesville Tabernacle, as opposed to, say, other tabernacles people may think of?
Well, the Kanesville Tabernacle, you're right that, when we think of tabernacles, it's not this grand building that will hold thousands of people. It really was just a big log cabin. In fact, Jacob Norton, who was a member of the church and a faithful journal keeper, in writing of the conference that was held where the First Presidency was reorganized, he wrote that conference commenced in the commodious log house built by the saints, being 40 by 60 feet. And then he continued by calling the tabernacle the biggest log cabin in the world. And so it was just a large log structure. And the reports I've read about it is that it was designed to hold 1,000 people. But it would have been very tight if you had 1,000 people in there. So it's not a tabernacle by today's standards, or even comparing it to the Salt Lake Tabernacle. It's nowhere near the size, but it was called a tabernacle because it was a gathering place for the saints, not necessarily because of the size of the building or the wonderful architecture. It was a place where the saints could meet together. And it was specifically built for this conference in 1847, where the First Presidency would be reorganized. So it served its purpose, and it lasted a few years after that. But the purpose for which it was designed and built, it fulfilled. By
standards of that reason, it certainly filled the the definition of tabernacle.
I did.
What are some of the other historical sites, buildings, or markers that can be found in the Council Bluffs area if visitors should happen to show up?
Yeah, most people, when they visit the area, they first go to winter quarters, which is right across the river, and the Mormon Trail Center that is there is a wonderful site to visit, and the temple and the cemetery there. But across the river, besides the tabernacle, we do have a few historic markers that mark the location of either important places or activities. There's a marker there of the Grand Encampment. The encampment kind of took much of the region, but the marker there kind of documents where it all started. Secondly, I mentioned Hyde Park. And that's where Orson Hyde had his home, and where the Quorum of the 12 met and decided to reorganize the First Presidency. And there's a marker there marking the site of Hyde Park and the cabin where this took place. And also we have a marker about the Mormon Battalion mustering grounds. This is where the battalion was brought together and organized, and from whence they commenced their march west. And then if you have a little more time, you can drive out to Garden Grove and Mount Pisgah. As I mentioned before, there's not a lot there. There's a marker documenting or marking each of the sites. But even though we only have the physical tabernacle to go visit, but there's a power about being at a place, even if there's nothing else there. For example, when I was back in Kanesville, I went to the mustering grounds, and just to be there and read the marker and then think about the hundreds of men who gathered here, and I imagine the families of these men gathering around them and supporting them and saying their final goodbyes. There's a power of being at the place. And the same with Garden Grove and Mount Pisgah and any historic site that the church has around the world.
I tend to agree that these sites that were just so temporary in the large scheme of things, but the significance of the things that took place there certainly bear finding more about. I was fortunate with the Tabernacle Choir Tour a summer or two ago to go visit the Kanesville Tabernacle, and it's just such a pleasant place to be. And
it is.
Just to think about the significance of what took place there and all the sacrifice. And so anyway, it's a wonderful place, and I would, with you, encourage anyone who can to be sure and visit.
It really is a blessing to be able to work with church history and to share this with members of the church, and I hope as they listen to this and the other programs that have been developed that they find that church history can bless their lives as well.
Thank you very much. We've been visiting with Gary Boatwright Jr. today, discussing the Kanesville Tabernacle and the historical events, the very significant events surrounding it. Thank you again.
Thank you.